Lawrence Waldron. Dr. Waldron?
Remembering to unmute myself. Thank you very much for that gracious introduction. Thank you to Indigenous peoples' heritage, their partners, their team for having me and being interested in my work. I'm honored to be with Ambassador Gill and was very touched by what Senator Thomas said about indigeneity and what Native American activists here in the United States have begun to call survivance, which is not just surviving, but celebrating your survival and advocating for continued survival and flourishing and reclamation of what has been lost. I'm going to share my screen now with, first let me clean up my screen. And let's share this. But before we get started with my frontispiece, I put in something just before that, which is a plaque that's in front of the National Museum of the American Indian here in what is now known as New York. And so I begin with an acknowledgement that I am coming to you from the land of the Lenape people, otherwise known as the Delaware people. I'm coming to you specifically from a part of Lenape territory that is now known as Jamaica, Queens. And the funny thing about that is that the Lenape called this area Jamaica, but the British didn't bother to learn the new spelling, going back to something that was said by the ambassador. So they just adopted a word that they already knew, namely Jamaica. The island of Jamaica, they just adopted that spelling for the place Jamaica, which basically is a kind of riverine or land of rivers kind of place here in what is now known as Queens. So it's funny, you end up living in Jamaica, Queens, but the spelling has nothing to do with the place. It was borrowed from an island which also got its name misspelled and mispronounced by the British. Jamaica is closer to the original pronunciation of the island of Jamaica. So if that's not too confusing, I'll just point out to you that this plaque says that the supposed sale of Manhattan Island for a handful of trinkets to Europeans was not recorded anywhere except in that popular myth. And in fact, there is no land deed that shows that the island of Manhattan was ceded by the Indians to Europeans. And that's a plaque actually in front of the American Indian Museum. So it kind of points out that all of those marvelous buildings on this island of Manhattan are built on land for whom no one can find the deed. Can you imagine if the bank asked you for your land deed and you couldn't find it? So I start with this acknowledgement that we are on the land of the Lenape here in New York, and I am speaking to you in my native Caribbean about the survivance or the continuities across 2,000 years of pre-Columbian Caribbean art. So I thought I would flip the map a little bit, or at least rotate it. We think of the world very much in a global north kind of bias, where we think United States, Europe, and China are on top. And a lot of people say that plan went south on you, meaning the plan went bad. So that people further south of these places, they think they understand very clearly. This is a kind of biased way of looking at the world to put the North on top. We get that there's a scientific basis for this, that that's where one of the poles is. But you could easily flip the map, or you could turn it as I have here, to put the East at the top of the world, which is more likely how Native people saw it, not just in the Caribbean, but in other parts of the Americas. The sun rises in the East. So that's the top of the day. It is the top of the world. And the West is the region of the dying light. The West is the place of the setting sun, the place of the dead. And very much as you study the traditional narratives of ancient Caribbean people, you realize they do kind of think, the Taino thought of the Eastern Caribbean as a kind of origin place and used to cite their connection with it all the time. And the people of the Eastern Caribbean saw the mainland as a kind of sort of Eastern place as well. The mainland does extend farther east than the islands do. So I just thought in the process of sharing the native names of the islands with you, I would also share a kind of orientation that's a bit different to how we are used to looking at the Caribbean. And of course, I had to give a shout out to Dominica here with this photo. Her body is tall, Waitukubuli. The unimaginative name of Dominica causes some of the mail sent from Brooklyn and Queens to our relatives in Dominica to end up in the Dominican Republic because of the unimaginative naming of these islands by the Spaniards, or rather the renaming. So if Columbus found you on a Sunday, he called you Domingo. And so that's how we get these multiple places with the same name, confusing the US Post Office, who often don't sit down to study, Dominica is over here and Dominican Republic is over here. So that's just a small problem that's created by the renaming. There are much bigger problems that I think we are getting more and more sensitive to. These are the colonial names, of course, of the place, and not at all what we're looking for in a talk like this. But I just want to break up the Caribbean for you. You know about Greater and Lesser Antilles, obviously, but in, let's say, October of 1491, there were as many as 12 different languages spoken in the Caribbean. So there would have been Wadao, Shibayo, Yao, Karinepagoto, Nepoyo, Arawakan, Lokono, and Kalina people in Trinidad alone. And in Western Cuba, there would have been people like the Guanahatabe and the Siboney. In the Central Archipelago in Puerto Rico and Hispaniola, you would have had people we kind of refer to as the classic Taino, because Taino culture sort of originates in this region. But they were intermarried with people called the Western Taino, which included the Lucayo of the Bahamas. And in fact, these people are descended from these people as the migration tended to go from east to west, like I was just saying when I turned the map. And then there were Eastern Taino who lived as far east as Antigua and maybe even got into further south in the Lesser Antilles. And what distinguishes the Eastern and Western Taino from the so-called classic Taino is that while their leaders were very impressive to the Spaniards with all the beautiful feather cloaks and all the pomp and circumstance, Columbus was obsessed with the not just gold, but also with the beauty of a Taino chief that he met in Jamaica, for instance. But in Eastern and Western Taino, we find that leadership is a lot less strict and is a lot less powerful than the caciques in this region here, which is the Taino homeland. The kings in this area, and we have to call them kings, they have other kings under them answering to them. And so these caciques are really kings, whereas these caciques tend to be more like chiefs. And so it's just a looser organization because less people answer to the leader. In this green area is where we have the people who have been variously called as island Caribs, but who we now call the Kalinago. And I have to point out that the Kalinago, just like many other people in this region, were Arawakan speakers. Most of the Kalinago language is actually Arawakan. So even the dichotomy between Caribs and Arawaks is loaded with falsities in and of itself before we even get to that peaceful this and war like that. Kalinago children grow up speaking an Arawakan language, and it's only when they reach a certain age, if they are boys, the men pull them aside and teach them like an extra language that's a kind of Arawakan Caravan mix. And so this is the region of the Kalinago, who often, we've been told that they often went into this area to raid, but they also went into this area to work as mercenaries for various Taino caciques who hired them as part of their standing army or temporary armies. And so I just wanted to point out to you that it's not just the Kalinago who are Arawakan speaking people, but lots of people are Arawakan speakers. So we've got like 12 languages spoken in the region, but Arawakan is the lingua franca. That's my point. And in addition to that, it turns out that Arawakan speakers were the most widely distributed Native Americans in the Americas. They are the most widely distributed indigenous group in the Americas in terms of linguistics. So you can find them all the way down in the Gran Chaco near the Argentinian border. You can find them in the Andean foothills. All of these are names of Arawakan ethnicities. You can find them in the Guianas. You can find them in the foothills of the Colombian Andes, all up through the Caribbean. And yes, there are some Arawakan names for parts of Florida. That looks to me like a 3,000-mile span. I mean, there are very few language groups that are this widely distributed anywhere in the world. I guess Indo-European would be one of them, and Malayo-Polynesian is another one. And Malayo-Polynesians have this in common with Arawakans, that they like their boats. So they spend a lot of time exploring by sea. So those are among the top 3 language groups in terms of the breadth of their distribution over a geographic space. Now, the museums of the Caribbean are brimming full in their storage areas with pottery shards, like you're seeing here, of various different periods in Amerindian history, going back at least 2,000 years before the conquest. And so you pull drawers upon drawers upon drawers in Antigua of these white on red shards. In Antigua, while I was just walking in a field, I kept on running into broken Adornos. The little decorative handles on pots are called Adornos. And very often, if you drop a pot by accident, back in pre-Columbian times, the pot would shatter and the only surviving thing would be the little densely sculpted decorative handles. And so that's what Adornos are. This one, you can just make out an eye, a nose, a feather crown. And I'll show you something like this again soon. And then, of course, they also end up on display in the museums, and we admire them as beautiful works of art, but they all have a whole intellectual history behind them, and very often a kind of narrative of their own. So I thought I would give you just a quick primer, like your first primer in school, of the different periods, and hopefully impress you as well with the complicated history of the Caribbean. It's not a simple thing. There were 2 kinds of Amerindians. There were lots of different kinds of Amerindians. I already told you at least 12 languages. There were just 3 or 4 languages spoken on Hispaniola, like I said, half a dozen in Trinidad, 3 or 4 in Cuba, but we also have this diversity over time. And so here's a very vague chronology. These dates are very vague. So in ancient times, very ancient times, 3 to 8,000 years ago, were various different people who we call under the umbrella archaic. And they're from about 3000 BCE to 1500 CE, they are still around and making art. So they're not archaic because they're dead and gone and they're far away. They're archaic because they're the oldest surviving population in the region. The Arawakan people come and meet them, and that's my red square, right? So the red square is showing you where the Arawakan people first arrive and spread out really fast. From 500 BCE to like the 1st century of the Common Era, there's an Arawakan spread across this region. And that is the famous Saladoid era. In the Eastern Caribbean, we think Saladoid all the time. In the Greater Antilles, they don't really think that because the Saladoid people only reach Eastern Hispaniola, easternmost Dominican Republic. They're always followed around by people we call them the Barrancoid, after the site of Los Barrancos and Barrancas in Venezuela, where their pottery was first studied. And their dates are a little different, but they fall within the bracketed dates of the Saladoid. So I won't dwell too much on that. But basically, they make their presence heavily felt in the Eastern Caribbean around the 1st to 7th century or so. There is a unique culture in Eastern Puerto Rico that expands as far east as Guadeloupe, where they live right next to the Saladoid and sometimes seem to be in some kind of transculturation with them, and they're called the Hoicoid culture. And I'll be showing you examples of this kind of everyone's art, really. The Hoicoid culture are very different from the Saladoid in many ways, although Irving Rouse, the famous archaeologist, first saw them as Hoican Saladoid. That's turned out to be a mistake. Their diet was different. Their diseases were different. We know this from studying the plaque in their teeth, and actually their coprolites, their fossilized feces has been analyzed by scientists to tell us they're eating mushrooms and different kinds of seafood. They're an ethnic minority living in and amongst sometimes the Saladoid people. New York is full of ethnic minorities, and I happen to be Trinidad native, so I've grown up around ethnic minorities my whole life. I feel a deep connection with the Hoicoid people. Trimasoid is a kind of a post-Saladoid culture. We suspect same people, but their pottery is changing. Calavini, we're not absolutely sure of their ethnicity. They may also be post-Saladoid Arawakans, same ethnicity, but radically different pottery, but with some of the same symbols. Coyote pottery has now been firmly associated with Kalinago people. But I would like to point out that I think that Trimasoid people might have also been early ancestors of the people we now call the Kalinago as well. You can ask me why I think that later. In the post-Saladoid era, Arawakans keep expanding westward from their eastern origins, and the first expression of that in archaeology is the Osteonin Osteonoid. I just call them Osteonin in my publications. People get sick and tired of hearing all these oids. And so they start out like right where the Saladoid leaves off, and their pottery is very different. You'll see some examples of that. Right on the Dominican-Haitian border, well, where the modern border is, but on the Haitian side, there's a kind of version of what might be Osteonoid pottery called Melakan, but it might also be partially archaic people who are mixing with the Taino people and creating this new kind of pottery, because it's quite a bit different from Osteonin. And that happens after Osteonin has settled in and begun to phase out. In fact, these two will combine into this third one, which we know as Taino pottery. And so that's a crash course in the periods of Amerindian art in the region, Amerindian artifacts. But the further back you go, the less you know about what the people thought of themselves. But again, their artifacts have clues. So, right, so those are my boxes. I forgot to click on those, sorry. So first thing I want to do is dispel the idea that archaic peoples are somehow primitive peoples. The Spaniards report that even the Taino call these people cave people, when in fact, these are probably the people who first introduced manioc or cassava, maize, and a whole bunch of other fruits, foods, tanya, maybe hog plums, what we just call plums and governor plums, right? They probably introduced a lot of these foods. And so the credit that we usually give to Arawakan people for introducing these domesticates probably belongs to the archaic people. And I'm confronting you here with a very important piece of cave art, which unfortunately the Cuban government has restored. And sometimes when government agencies are working in the name of patriotism instead of in the name of archaeology, they tamper with things a little bit, but their restoration isn't so bad that we don't understand what's going on here. In fact, we have some early drawings of this by archaeologists that indicate that there were always 56 rings here. And half of those are black and half of those are red. And if you divide that number by 2, you end up with the number of days in a month. A lunar month is 28 days. That's why it's called month. The word moon is right inside of it. And so this seems to be some kind of dating diagram, which also obviously we recognize as art because aesthetics are involved. It's inside of Cueva Uno off the western coast of Cuba. There's an island called Isla de la Juventud. And this cave, you'll notice it has a kind of panoramic entrance. And when you look out the entrance, you can track the sun across the sky from January to December in all the key positions of the sun that mark what month it is. So it's an observatory is what I'm saying. And then there's this lunar diagram on the ceiling. I've done some study of this, but only from afar because I haven't been to Cueva Uno as yet. But this little figure inside of the rings here is a circle within a circle. And the circle inside of the bigger circle is half the diameter of the bigger circle. And so if you put a point in the center of the circle and you rotate and revolve this circle inside of that circle, from this view, you will only ever see one side of this circle. It is a way of observing the moon. They know that the moon is round, they know that it's a sphere, and they know that they only ever see one side of it. My justifications for this are lengthily explained in one of my books. So this place is a lunar and solar observatory, and I just thought I would drop that on you as something about so-called archaic people who barely have any pottery and they're hunter-gatherers. These are the things we say about them. And I've just pointed out to you that no, they had some basic horticulture and they were master astronomers. They were also the masters of stone sculpture. A lot of Arawakan people who enter the Caribbean, they come from the silty delta of the Orinoco River. Not all of them, but some of them come from the Delta where they have to walk miles to get good stone. And so they are not the greatest stone carvers when they come. They are the greatest potters. They're the greatest ceramicists, but not the greatest stone carvers. And who do they pick up all of this stone carving skill from? It is these archaic people, like the Siboney in Cuba, like the Wadao in Trinidad. There are various different kinds of archaic people living throughout the archipelago. There is some known presence in Grenada, if I'm not mistaken. This is a better view of the diagram that shows you this figure is known in geometry studies as a Tusi couple because it's named after the Middle Eastern mathematician who first devised it to account for rotation and revolution at the same time. And this is what I mean by master stone carvers. We find these perfect or near perfect stone spheres in their graves a lot. And we also find the most marvelous iterations of stone carved axes in the Caribbean. This pattern was probably added by Tainos who collected archaic stonework like they were precious antiques. So I don't know if you've ever considered that before, that ancient Native American people were also antiquarians of even previous Native American people. But then we come to the arrival of the Arawakans, who bring this major pottery industry with them. That's the only way I could think of it or express it, is as an industry. And in this industry, we find that they've been doing this for quite some time. The saladoid in South America goes back to maybe the second millennium BCE, but it arrives in the Caribbean around 500 BCE, and it is masterfully made. When you flick it with your finger, it sounds like metal or glass because it's very high fired. The walls, they fire it at over 1,000 degrees is what I'm saying, or somewhere close to that, between 800 and 1,000. And the walls of the pots are very thin and they are very expertly painted, very often, more often than not, white on top of red. So that means this shape here was dropped out. This shape here was dropped out. The painter, she painted this. I'm convinced that the potters were female, and I've justified that in publications. But this was painted with discipline to leave out this shape. This was painted, and this was painted with discipline and control to leave this out. And what are they painting with? They're painting with paintbrushes that are probably just the chewed ends of the kinds of dried hard grass that Kalinago people still weave their baskets out of, laruma. And so their paintbrush is very simple, so their skill has to be far greater than someone with like a Western or a Chinese paintbrush to produce these kinds of patterns in which you're painting the white but leaving out the red. And so that's how these pots were painted, in a kind of dropout method, which leaves you thinking, well, is this the character or is this the character? Because in the Western tradition, what you paint is what you want people to look at, not what you drop out. Well, drop that idea, because very often the red and the white are working in tandem with each other. Whether one is painted and the other is not, doesn't matter. The Hoicoid pottery is not famous for its painting. It's famous for being monochrome, and this is what it looks like. It's highly expressive in terms of sculpture and also incised decoration, things that you carve, right? And eventually these two traditions collide and they become the Cedrosan saladoid. And here's an example from Puerto Rico. Here's one from Trinidad. And so you get this tradition that's both painted and modeled, or painted and sculpted. Modeled is just the word we use in ceramics. Now, when Arawakan people enter the Caribbean, they enter into this vast trading sphere, probably set up by archaic people. And so they begin to participate in it. And the sphere of trading extends far and wide, all the way to Central and Mesoamerica. In fact, archaeologists at the University of Calgary have done studies on these jade celts, because they're not just jadeite. Some of them are nephrite, which is actually the true jade, what Chinese people consider jade. So it's nephrite, jadeite, and various kinds of greenstone like serpentinite, and these are called social jades. They're not geologists. They're beautiful, shiny green stones to the Amerindians, so they're all a kind of category within themselves. And people at the University of Calgary have sourced some of this jade back to the Motagua Valley in Guatemala, which is where the Olmec and the Maya got their jade. And so this jade is being traded over vast distances to make its way to places like Montserrat, Antigua, Grenada, Trinidad, St. Kitts, Nevis. And returning to our chronology here, the Trimasoid pottery is a bit simpler looking in terms of its painted and sculpted decoration, but I don't want you to just think like an art historian who's always looking for beautiful things. The Trimasoid era is an era of great innovation as well, because that's when apparently the women got tired of cooking on a griddle that would sometimes slide off the hot stones that they were cooking with. So they decided, why don't we put legs on this thing? So we get tripod griddles during that period. And very cleverly, Amerindians in Barbados and Carriacou figure out a way how to get fresh water on their islands, which are very dry during the dry season, by using their broken pottery to make these wells, which they build down inside of the sand near the seawater, actually. And you would think, well, won't it fill with seawater? Well, seawater does seep in at the bottom, but rain seeps in from the top. And so the well becomes eventually filled with mostly fresh water, with the seawater down on the bottom. So when you hit seawater, stop drinking. But the fresh water floats on top of the seawater because it's lighter. And so the people on the dry islands figure out how to make these things out of their broken pottery. So archaeologists sometimes find them in Jewel found this one and half excavated it, I think, in Barbados. Calavini pottery is what you're looking at here. It's closely associated with Grenada and Baliso and a couple other islands in the Grenadines. A couple islands to the north of Grenada as well have produced this kind of pottery. A student once suggested to me that maybe it's just one family since it's so rare. And I said, well, it does exist over a period of hundreds of years. And he says, well, maybe they're just passing it down within the family. And I thought that's a very interesting theory, because it is very much a minority pottery that might possibly be the product of a clan or a family. It's not a bad idea. And so I hope you're making note of the dates, but I'll remind you when I need to. And this is what this pottery looks like. And so I'm just introducing you to the different kinds of pottery. Coyote Ceramics, they take their vessel forms very similar to that of Taino pottery, and that's kind of consistent with the story we hear of Taino men coming back from the Greater Antilles with captured brides, bride capture. And I think that sometimes they came back with Taino women who they married as a kind of signal of friendship between them and the leadership of various Taino polities in the Greater Antilles. So it might not have always been bride capture, but that's how we end up getting this these Taino elements in the pottery of Kalinago people. And here you're seeing something I'll discuss later, frog imagery that is very often part of all the pottery of the Caribbean. Frog imagery is often not just a decorative, but a very symbolic element in a lot of this pottery. This is what Hoicoid objects look like. They have Adornos, just like the Arawakan pottery does, but they're also famous for this brilliant stonework and the various kinds of jade, depicting something that you don't see in the rest of Caribbean art, which is Andean condors, sometimes carrying turtles, sometimes carrying human heads, and we don't know if those are decapitated heads or if the condor takes the mind of the shaman on high. So how to interpret them is a bit unclear, because this is a minority group in a small geographic area, and we only have so many artifacts to work with. This is what Osteonin and Melakan pottery looks like. Osteonin is very plain. It's like they jettison all the color decoration of the solidoid. But Melakan, they start introducing some sculptural elements. But I want to go back to Osteonin just to point something out to you that passes down to Melakan. I want you to just keep in mind how unlike solidoid pottery this is, not just in color, which I've already pointed out, but in form. And I'll show you where I'm going with that in a minute. This is what Taino pottery looks like. It's extremely expressive. It very much uses Adornos, just like solidoid pottery did, but in some new stylistic ways. And in fact, what you're looking at is meant to be well, to us, it looks like an erotic pot. I mean, those are obviously breasts, and that's obviously a phallic. So we've got this mammiform and phallic image combined here. And you might think, well, what do those two things have in common? Why would they even be combined together? What kind of porno pot is this? But in fact, these two parts of the human body produce the white liquids that start and sustain a baby. And so give that some thought as a kind of Taino equivalent of yin yang, the masculine and the feminine in union. And right at the juncture, they put this kind of composite bat owl, which is a symbol of the ancestors. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later. And just here is another example of Taino pottery. But if I lay Taino pottery next to solidoid pottery, you'll see that there are some major similarities and differences. That's what the talk is about. And I'll do that soon. But continuing with the Taino, though, because they were nearer in time to us, we have a lot of their artifacts by comparison. A lot of them were destroyed. These cloth ones were mostly destroyed by Spaniards. We think of the Spaniards as arriving during this period of awakening and exploration in Europe known as the Renaissance. But the Spaniards were also bringing the Spanish Inquisition with them. So an object like this would immediately be seen as a demonic thing that needs to be destroyed. And when they look at how the native people revere them or fear them, they definitely want to destroy them. Now, why would native peoples make these if they feared them? Well, people from another community might fear yours because it is an image of one of your fearsome ancestors that they didn't have such good relations with. And here's an image of Boinael, the rain giver, with the tears carved into his face. Here's another image of Boinael with the tears dripping from his face. The tears, he gives us the rain. The rain is his tears. And there's lots of images of him and Marohu, so the gods of rain and drought, appearing together in Taino art is a very common sight. This kind of pairing of opposites. There they are again, overlooking Lago Enriquillo in Dominican Republic. Inside some of the caves in Dominican Republic, we see images like this of the guaizas, the living spirits, or perhaps the opias, the spirits of the dead, painted on the walls. Alongside these, what we might consider more sophisticated images, are these more stick figure-like images, which are often used for narratives. So whereas these are used for themes, these are often storytelling, and I'll stop to deal with one of them soon. Right, so that's Taino rock art. So here I'm showing you the Salvador de Taino continuities now in the real meaty part of my presentation, I guess. And one of the first things you're going to see connecting the images over time, like this Barbadian image and this Taino image here, is the image of this grimacing shaman. And so I'm going to do some comparisons for you. And the first thing I want to do in terms of continuities over time is something stylistic. So the idea of figure ground reversal, when you can't tell, well, what's the figure and what's the ground? In other words, what's the background and what's the thing I'm supposed to be looking at? I've already raised this looking at another piece of white on red pottery, but are we supposed to be looking at this rope around the center, or are we supposed to be looking at this figure over here, this rectangle? Is it the white rectangle or the red hourglass shape that's in the center that we should be looking at? Is it this star symbol here we should be looking at? It's in white, or should we be looking at this volute, this unpainted area here in red? And what I'm saying is that the red and white go together, and they're painting around things that they want you to look at in the empty space. That's not an empty space to them, and they're painting physical things that they want you to look at. Sometimes they paint faces on here. And you might think, well, it's just a red ground, so it's the white parts that they want you to look at because that's the part that they're painting. Well, here that's true, because this is both a frog and a bat symbol. And here it's true because that's a star symbol. But here it's not true. Here they want you to look at the volute. And so they are used to painting in this way. They are used to looking at their painting in this way. And so when we bring our Western mind to it of, I'm supposed to be looking at the thing that was painted, not the thing that was not painted, we get a little confused. So we call it figure ground reversal. There's another thing that's going on here, which is contour rivalry, and I'll use another image just to illustrate that to you. But I put this belt in here right now just to point out to you that it's not just that they're painting white on a red ground, so it must be the white thing we're looking at. They transfer this whole white on red way of thinking to other arts. It's just that we don't have a lot of surviving belts, beaded belts to look at. And here you might ask, well, is it the white part or the red part that we should be looking at? And so you find yourself asking the same question, even though we've switched from just painting with white on a red surface. Now we're dealing with beads that had to be selected. She selected red beads, she selected white beads, she selected black beads. And so you can't just say the red is the ground and the white is on top of it, so I better look at the white. If that's a little confusing, it'll become a little clearer in some of the other slides. So here's an example of contour rivalry. a lot of the Adornos on these pots, they change what they're depicting as you move around them. And I want you to imagine now that you're around a fire, looking at them as they're being used to present foods to an honored person, an honored ancestor, or a god, because these painted ceramics, they go on altars and they're broken out like your grandmother's fine china, only on special occasions. So when we look at this pot from Guadeloupe from the side, we see the snake-like neck with a bird-like head, and it kind of reminds us of a wading bird. You know, those aquatic birds like egrets and cormorants and all those birds. And yes, they're going for that. They want you to think of a swamp bird. But when you see it from above, you realize, hey, that's a human face. So 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, just like the Adorno I showed you in the field earlier, 2 ears with ear spools in them even, and some kind of crown on the head. But when you see it from an angle, you realize, and I put this one in just so you could see it from the same kind of angle. When you see it from a 3/4 view, you realize you're seeing yet a third thing. And here's what I mean. When you see it from above, you're seeing an eye, a nose, a mouth, a crown, 2 ears. When you see it at an angle, this thing that was a bird head from the side and is a human head from on top becomes a turtle. And a lot of the Adornos are like that. All you have to do is turn them and they become something else. In addition to that, this pot has this cute little Adorno on the other side of a little bird. And you might wonder, well, why did they put that? Was that just whimsical? But actually, I've found traditional narratives in which a distance flying seabird helps a small bird like a hummingbird or a songbird get to another island so that they can steal tobacco seeds for a shaman and bring it back. The distance bird handles the distance, but the maneuverability bird, the one that flies in all of these sharp little directions, can avoid the Amazon women archers who are on that island, who have struck down everyone else who's tried to get the secrets of tobacco. And so that's a narrative from the Wadao and Arawakan territory in northeastern South America that explains why a long-necked bird might have something to do with a little tiny songbird or hummingbird. And so a pot like this might be referencing that story. And we saw this Taino pot before that has that kind of masculine and feminine fertility symbolism on it. And so why is it back here? Well, first I want to point out to you that this little pot fragment from Montserrat has 2 eyes painted on it and then a red beak that's sculpted. But when you see the red beak from the side, the red beak becomes the head of a turtle. So an owl's big eyes, like you're seeing here, with a beak that turns into a turtle. So as you turn the pot changes its meaning. And just like I told you the story of the big bird and the little bird that got the seeds of tobacco, there was probably a story associated with owls and turtles. There's lots of symbolism that connect them as well. Maybe some of it will come up before I finish. And so here we shouldn't be surprised that we see a bat snout, but we see the big round oculate appearance of an owl like that. And you might wonder, well, why do they combine bats and owls? That's an easy one. It's bats and owls are seen as in-laws. They're actually described as in-laws because they're both night flying creatures. In fact, in the Southern Caribbean, we have oil birds which use echolocation and eat exactly what bats eat, even though they look like owls. So ancient people would have seen all of these as a set of night flying creatures. And here's a bat with the flying wing symbol that also When you see it another way, becomes the head of a bird. And here's another wing symbol. This is the Arawakan bat signal, basically. Here's one and here's one, but it's actually made up of two birds seen side by side. All right, and so here's the bat's head. The bat has two massive ear spools, so we know the bat is actually not just a bat, it's an ancestor. Bats are how ancestors leave their island to come visit the islands of the living. The island of the dead, they fly out of there as bats and then take human form when they visit the living. And so this is a wing symbol broken into two, but each one also looks like a bird. So this kind of multivalence is called contour rivalry, when two figures share the same space and they join, or they share a margin where they connect and become something else. It's called contour rivalry. And so that's what you're seeing the bat wings being made out of bird heads doing here. By the way, if you see this same stone belt from above, it forms actually a bunch of skulls. That's one eye, and there's another eye on the other side. So there's three images coming out of there. So Tainos do it, but their ancestors during the Saladoid did it as well. Images with multiple meanings. A very common emblem that you see in both of their art is this kind of scrolling meander. It kind of reminds you of a snake, but very often it resolves into the the four legs of a frog, actually. But here it is on a white on red pot from St. Vincent. Here it is along the top of a pedestal from Dominican Republic, where they used to grind the entheogenic, is what we call it now. Western scientists call it hallucinogenic powder, cohoba. It's called an entheogenic by the new anthropologists. And up on top of there is where that preparation was held, but here is the pattern. And it's a scrolling pattern that you find everywhere, amongst other things like spirals. There's a scrolling pattern. And we'll try to decipher what this pattern might mean soon. That's a curvilinear pattern. Here's a rectangular or rectilinear version of it that we still see in Caribbean arts in South America, like Carib speaking people still make these kinds of patterns in their weaving of cloth and their weaving of baskets. Tail down, I think, means jaguar. Tail up means monkey. And we find those same kinds of rectilinear designs in the beadwork again. I'll be using this belt for a lot of things. So they're called meanders. They can be rectilinear or curvilinear. And you're seeing the same kind of curving lines here, but you're also seeing spirals. And the art historian Dicey Taylor once suggested in the 90s that these spirals might have something to do with the passage of time. And I've seen evidence that she was right about that. At the time, she was speculating based on ethnographic analogy with other people who use spirals, but there's some proof of that, and I'll show you. So speaking of that figure ground reversal, I just wanted to show you this particularly good example from Puerto Rico. You're obviously looking at a face. Some of these patterns on white on red pottery resolve into faces. See the little jagged teeth there? It's probably a bat face, fruit bat. And look at this hourglass shape here. And the hourglass is a recurring figure in both Saladoid and Taino art. So you're looking at hourglass here, but then you're looking at two hourglasses over here. And so nose and two eyes. Now what noses and eyes have in common in the minds of many ancient people, eyes emit and receive. They both transmit and receive light. This is how a lot of ancient cultures around the world think about eyes. Today, our science tells us light enters our eye. But in the ancient way of thinking, your eye transmits, bounces off the thing, and then receives information back, almost like laser sensing today. Right? And what does that have in common with a nose? Well, a nose also breathes in and breathes out. And we tend to find this hourglass symbol wherever things are changing direction. They go in and out, in and out. In fact, it might have something to do with making the image seem alive, is to put this symbol on it, that things come in and things go out. So it's a place of transition. It's like a doorway, a liminal space on the body. And a lot of people I show this pot to, they always comment on the fallopian shape, the kind of gynoform shape that they think they're seeing here. But it's also a bat symbol. So I see what they're seeing, but I'm also seeing this scroll that is one of the versions of the bat signal, as I called it earlier. And in the midst of it is this hourglass shape that seems to indicate that the bat is taking something in and sending something out. And we find that same kind of symbol on the backrest of a chair, a duho. And we find it everywhere. And it seems to be a symbol of intake and output that makes the thing seem alive, like it's circulating in some way. And here's that pot again, but now I want to draw your attention to the volute, which you're seeing over here as well. So here the red character, the bat symbol, is what they want us to look at. There are faces on either side of this, by the way. And just to prove my point, this is the bat wing symbol. I even give you flight patterns of bats here to support it. And we find it used on the foreheads of naturalistically depicted bats. And we find it on the foreheads of humans as a kind of association between them and the bat. Here it is again in the Trumasoid example from Martinique. And here it is again in a Taino example. So I just want you to look at these without any labeling whatsoever, because on the left is Saladoid and on the right is Taino. And just like 3 seconds of silence just to look at these. What a difference. Did the same people make these? Could people sharing an ancestry have possibly made things so different? The Saladoid potters are obsessed with what we would call Euclidean geometry. They're interested in spheres, cylinders, cones, and this everted or inverted bell shape is a variation on several of those. This is technically a cylinder that's larger at the top, so it's a cylinder that's part cone, right? So that's how they think in these kinds of strict geometric ways. They think like artists who are mathematicians. The Taino, on the other hand, are very concerned with elasticity. And yet this emblem of the roundel with the zigzag or the undulation around it is a Saladoid symbol. So the decoration actually comes from the Saladoid. You may have seen it in some of my previous slides, but this shape does not come from the Saladoid. It's a new thing. And it happened somewhere between the Osteonin and the Melakan. And so this very organic form that looks like a swelling bulbous organ that's slack here, but then taut right here and taut right there is a new aesthetic of form for the Taino. I don't want you to think, though, that the Taino have forgotten the geometric lessons of their ancestors. They're perfectly capable of making spherical, cylindrical, and various other geometric ceramics. but they're a lot more interested in this kind of pot. You see this more often. And technically that mammiform phallic pot falls into this category of organic aesthetics that I've been talking about. You'll also notice that their surfaces are decorated with lines that end in dots. This linear design ending with a punctation. So we could call it punctilinear decoration. And we find that that originates actually in the Barrancoid pottery from back in Saladoid times. So the surface decoration is Saladoid Barrancoid, but the form is a new thing. And also something that the Barrancoid doesn't get any credit for in the scholarship in the Greater Antilles, because no one cares about Barrancoid there. You know, we Trinis and Grenadians and Antiguans even are very interested in the Barrancoid, but it's not studied so much in the Greater Antilles. Another thing that comes from the Barrancoid are these so-called coffee bean eyes. That's where Taino art gets it. Not all Taino art uses it, but uses it quite often, and it comes from there. In fact, look at their hair and how it's parted. Same thing, except she's female and he's male. They're both pregnant, by the way. She's pregnant in the front, and when I show you the back of this sculpture, you'll see a lump on his back, and I'll explain what I mean by pregnant when I get to that. The story of Deminan Caracaracol was that he was one of 4 brothers. They were identical quadruplets, symbolic number 4 for Amerindians of the Caribbean. 4 is the number of completion, the 4 directions to go around a thing and come back where you started. And so him and his quadruplet siblings, they used to get into all kinds of adventures way back when the world was new. And in one of these early adventures in proto time, they offend a shaman by entering his house and asking him for bread. They just barge into his house, and he chases them, and they start running. And Deminan is the first one in and the last one out. The old man, he blows his nose in an expression of contempt. It's an expression still known by some people in the Amazon today. When you don't like someone or you look down on them, you blow your nose at them. And so the shaman did that, and the snot spattered on Deminan's back. And he thought, well, that's disgusting, but I'm glad I got away. But then the splatter, even after they cleaned it, turned into a swelling on his back. And the swelling got bigger and more painful. And eventually his brothers had to break his back open. And out of his back, they pried with their stone axes a turtle who had been gestating there. And we call her Turtle Woman because the brothers build a house for her. And all 4 marry her, and her children by them are probably the first 4 clans of the ancient Antillians, at least as told by the Taino. And so this is why I say he's pregnant in the image. We might call it his dorsal pregnancy. And on his back is actually a symbol of a turtle that we'll zoom in on if I get a chance. There it is, a little clearer for you. Now, remember I told you the stick figures are very often used for narrative. If we zoom in on this group here, there's a lot going on at Oyo de Sanabe in Dominican Republic, and you wonder how they got up there to do this drawing in charcoal. But if you zoom in on this drawing, you see a turtle, and you see a guy with a lump on his back. And you see somebody who seems to be sniffing something through a tube. Is probably Cohoba. So this is the shaman Bayamanako who they offended. And here's a turtle, and here's Deminan with a lump on his back, and here's one of his brothers prying the turtle out of his back. This whole thing seems to be out of order. Unless, and here, this might be one guy chasing another guy. So this whole thing seems out of order unless you read it this way. You start with Bayamanako, you arch over the entire image, and you come through here with these 2 images, and here's poor Deminan with the swelling on his back. Here's his brother prying his back open while he holds onto a tree. That's a nice touch. And then out comes Turtle Woman. So the story is arranged in a spiral. It's not arranged left to right like English people or French people read. It's not arranged right to left like Chinese people or Arabs read. It's arranged in a spiral to express that time is passing. So this is the proof I've found of Dicey Taylor's theory of spirals as the passage of time. They cover Piedra de Escrita in Puerto Rico. There are lots of spirals here, plus frogs. So there are lots of continuities in iconography. I'm going to do them fast. So hopefully there's time for Q&A. The gnashing teeth of the shaman. When you administer cohoba to yourself, it's very uncomfortable. Your eyes start running, your nose starts running, you start gnashing your teeth. And we find this imagery from Hispaniola to Barbados. And even in places where we don't find sculptures of it, we find the dentures having fallen out of such sculptures. This one is from the southern coast of Trinidad. And yet, it's a set of dentures just like these that would have been inlaid into a semi or a statue. Here's another continuity. Figures wrapped in their hammocks for burial. Some people call them swaddled figures. Some rock art specialists don't like that term because it makes them sound like babies, but actually you wrap the dead up like babies to put them back in the earth. From womb to tomb, and the tomb becomes a new kind of womb, right? So wrapped bodies are something we find in the Lesser Antilles in presumably late Saladoid, maybe Trumasoid context, like here in Guadeloupe and here in Puerto Rico during the Taino era. We find that a lot of the favorite animals of the Saladoid potters become the main animals of the Taino potters. The Saladoid potters put 22, maybe 25 different animals on their pots. But the ones that showed up most often on their pots become the ones that are accepted by the Taino. So those include fruit bats, which now you know, if you didn't know before, are the form that the dead take to fly out of Kauai. They're sort of city of the dead to visit the living. This censer from St. Vincent, a spectacular object, is a kind of chimney censer. You light incense under it, and then the eyes start glowing from the fire that's inside, then smoke starts rising out of the eyes and the mouth. What an image. And it's clearly a fruit bat. It's a philostomid bat with the leaf nose, the turned up nose that you see in Taino art all over the place, not just in pottery. Turtles are of major importance because turtles are the great mother. And in fact, if you've ever seen baby turtles making a break for it to the surf, you know that they're not just a symbol of the plentiful descendants of a mother, but they're a symbol of exodus, which I think is built into the story of the native peoples of the Caribbean, because they're aware that they've come here through travel and exodus. And travel and exodus is a major part of the traditional narratives of the Taino especially. I shot this, I think, with my iPhone 1 through the glass at the museum in the capital of Grenada, and have not been able to return to take a better photo of it. So if anyone has a gorgeous photo of it, please send it to me. I will return to Grenada on a proper field visit to catalog the objects in the museum at my first convenience. So turtles appear on everything. This is a pot stand. The pot goes on there. This is a metate or a mortar for grinding cassava flour or farina or corn flour. The turtle is depicted here as the mother. Here the turtle is a handle on a pot from Venezuela. And this is actually a turtle effigy. So what I want to do is turn this object over to figure out how they might have used it. And turtles are throughout rock art. This is an emblem from a Jamaican cave, actually. The one animal that I found that does not appear in the Venezuelan saladoid, but is extremely popular in the Caribbean is the owl. And here you see it in saladoid context, and here you see it in a Taino context. And so it's an important animal to both. And the owl is the messenger from the dead. The way that the Taino and the saladoid people before them thought about owls is where we get our belief in the jumbie bird. The bird that comes and sits in your mango tree and makes that disquieting call in the middle of the night. And if your grandmother was anything like mine, she would stomp her foot and she would say, "Oh God, somebody dead." And so I would say to her, "Well, you know, you're getting up in age. Most of your friends are going to be dying. It's just probability." And she would say, "No, someone died tonight." And invariably 2 or 3 days later, someone will come with the news, "You know, Miss So-and-so dead, you know." And so that's half of the full belief that the Amerindians had. Owls, depending on the nature of their cry, could announce deaths or births. So it's not just that the jumbie bird is a bad omen. Sometimes it was a very good omen because the owl is the messenger from the dead, and the dead know everything. They know when something is coming, bad or good. And so please remember that next time you hear mention of the jumbie bird, because this bird was also a bringer of good tidings. Now here we are at Caguana in Puerto Rico, and it's full of Rupestrian art, lots of petroglyphs on there. And as we zoom in, we see that a lot of them are birds, very consistent in their depiction with Taino sculpture, but also with saladoid sculpture and saladoid pottery. And aquatic birds seem to have something to do with storms and the beginning of the rainy season. The symbolism, the Sawaku symbolism, is a bit unclear to us. The living Kalinago people might be able to help us better interpret the meaning of these swamp birds, as I call them, the wading birds with the long legs and long beaks. But especially the egrets and the herons, they seem to be the ones that are being depicted in all of these different ways from all of these different periods. And in Cuba, we find that they are strangely similar. Pelicans are strangely similar to how they look in the Saladoid era, even though Cuba was settled by Tainos very late, like just before Columbus, like just a couple hundred years before Columbus. So why does the Cuban imagery of pelicans look so similar? We're not absolutely sure. Maybe it was a very conservative group of Tainos who did things the Saladoid way, who were the first to settle Cuba. This is definitely a Taino style pot in terms of its form. It's broken, and I can tell that it's one of those elastic pots. It's not one of those geometric Saladoid pots, but the Adorno is very similar to the ones we find in St. Vincent, Grenada, the Grenadines. And second only to the turtle is the frog in terms of symbolic importance across the Caribbean and across 2,000 years. So we find frog imagery not just by itself in things like snuff bowls. And this one might be Taino, but it might be Cayo, which would make it a Kalinago object from Guadeloupe. But we also find frog imagery combined with human imagery in the seated figures at Caguana. This is probably Yukahu, the semi of agriculture, and this is Atabera, the semi of freshwater. The two of them together cause your crops to grow. And here's that Cayo frog again from pottery fragment in St. Vincent. We find frogs in the cave art in Dominican Republic. We find it on rock art outside, exposed to the elements in St. Kitts and in Trinidad. And Caguana was probably used for great gatherings like you're seeing here in the main plaza. But then what were these used for? Maybe I'll get to that. I was walking the stones actually over here someplace on the cobblestone pavement around the Tamped Earth Plaza and almost stepped on this little coquille. This is a piping frog. They're about an inch long and they make an awesome noise in the middle of the night. Very disturbing to tourists trying to get some sleep in the Caribbean, but for us, it's kind of a comforting noise. We associate it with rain and we pass right out. And that frog started out as a naturalistic image and sometimes a somewhat stylized image. You know, it's turned into a design, but you can still tell it's a frog. But in the Caribbean, during the Saladoid era, it became this sophisticated, abstract symbol like you're seeing here that takes the form of a maze, or what we would call the Frog Labyrinth design. This is what Henri Petitjean Roger from Guadeloupe coined it sometime in the 70s or 80s, and the name stuck, the Frog Labyrinth. And we find it everywhere. We find it on body stamps to print designs on your body. We find it on boulders. This one is at Balenbouche in St. Lucia. We find it on pots, like you're seeing here around the mouth. And you might wonder, why did it turn into such an abstract symbol? It almost looks like a corporate logo. And that's probably because they're loading it up with symbolism. Stylization and abstraction are better for symbolism than naturalism. You know, making things look like real life is naturalism. And when things look like real life, you just kind of take them for granted. Well, that's a really nice art piece. It looks so real. And then you move on. But when a thing turns into an abstract symbol like this, it makes you think, well, what does it mean? And as you look at it, you think lots of different things. They're simple versions and very complicated versions of it. And this is a version in which the Taino turn it into a turtle, actually, where the circle in the middle becomes a parenthesis instead. And this circle in the center should not be taken for granted, because here it is as the mouth of the vessel. Here it is at the bottom of the vessel. Here it is accentuated and exaggerated on a stone object from St. Vincent. Here it is at the very center of a carved Taino object from Cuba. So you're looking at a span of 2,000 years here, from Cañas and Land's End in Barbados to Cuba. It's from the beginning of the Common Era, almost 2,000 years, to about 1,500. This is very late Taino if it's from Cuba. And when you look at it, you're thinking ripples, you're thinking, you know, like raindrops in water, and that's exactly what the frog is associated with. The frog is a symbol of the rainy season and its fertility. It's why it's associated with those two gods that make the crops grow. When the rainy season comes, that's when the frogs become amorous and they're singing all night. So they are harbingers or heralds of the rainy season. After you plant in the rainy season, there's not as much to do as during the harvest season. There's a lot of downtime, and I don't have to tell you, you're adults, you know that this is when a lot of women would get pregnant. It is the case that there was usually a bumper crop of babies 9 months after the planting season. And so it is a period of agricultural fertility, and it is a period of human fertility that is symbolized by the frog. Is why it becomes a kind of abstract symbol of the four directions, the rain falling in water, and all of those things I just discussed with respect to the agricultural and human fertility cycle. And of course, the most emblematic objects in the Caribbean are trigonal semis, or the three-pointer stones, about which I'm writing a book right now, and they originate in the Saladoid, where they were made of shell and jewel-like in their carved decorations. There's a period where they go through a bit of simplification as they switch from shell to stone. They never stop making shell ones, but they seem to prefer the stone after a while and make more of those. But then the stone ones get more and more fancy from the Trumasoid and Osteonin to the Taino period. And so they get more and more decorative, usually with the faces of gods and ancestors with secondary figures on top, with very stylized ribs, hips, shoulders, elbows, hands, feet. They become personified pieces of the earth. And because of their shape, I've identified 11 different shapes of these. They're not just three-pointers. They're three-pointed or three-cornered or sometimes conical and not pointed at all except on top. There are 11 different forms, and they all seem to be referring to the shape of the island when you see it from the horizon as you approach in your canoe. Not just the island, but the reflection of the island. Not just the island, but the clouds that gather, especially on the windward side of an island. Not just the island, but the shape of a turtle in the water, which again is associated with the land and the Great Mother. So there's a lot of symbolism going on with these objects, and the symbolism doesn't get more complicated. It starts out pretty complicated with a lot of frog imagery. Do you see the frog legs? That's the same meander that we were looking at earlier. It's frog legs. And some of these trigonalitos or three-pointed stones or trigonal semis seem to refer not to islands, but mountains. In fact, this mountain is called El Cerro El Semi, the mountain that overlooks Caguana. Caguana was probably put there because of this mountain. Many different kinds made out of lots of different materials, but starting with shell and the solidoid. And once they switch to stone, that frees them up to make it any size they want. This one weighs several kilos. I had to get help to lift it to photograph it at the Museum of the American Indian. And duhos also continue from the solidoid to the Taino. The first duhos are bench type. This one is from Pitch Lake. It's been carbon dated and everything. Securely dated to the solidoid. And the Pitch Lake is a place in Trinidad where if you leave your car parked the wrong way in the 1930s, you'll wake up in the morning and your car will be gone because the Pitch Lake sucked it in. And it rolled around in the Pitch Lake for 100 years, and it comes up in 2030, almost brand new if you can get all the pitch off of it. And that's what happened to this duho. So after 1,500 years, it came back to the surface. And it's relatively simple because it was probably hurriedly made for a burial because the Pitch Lake was used for burials. But in Puerto Rico, we see early Taino ones look a lot like it. And then they develop this shape that seems to be based on the hammock. And that's unique to the Caribbean, whereas this shape can actually be found in South America. The bench type was brought by the solidoid to the Caribbean, but then it evolved into this hammock type. And now we should start hamming up with some continuities, but distinctions. There's a common belief that ceremonial centers began in the Taino era, but at the site of Tibes in Puerto Rico, I stubbed my toe on white on red pottery. In fact, the Tibes Museum has lots of white on red solidoid pottery that they found in the ground right here. And this is where the settlement began, around this plaza with the dead buried under it. They recovered quite a lot of skeletons from under here. And from the ceremonial activities held in the center here, the activities got more and more diverse, and they made other plazas for different reasons. This one seems to be an observatory. It's very well sited for looking at the stars. And then these long ones that look like sport courts of some kind, like maybe for some kind of ball game. There's a tendency to call all of these bates after the game of batu, the ball game, but I think they were used for lots of different things. If you look at intertribal gatherings in the Amazon today, you'll find that when the different groups come together from far and wide to visit a particular town or village, to have like Amerindian Olympics, Amazonian Olympics. There are archery contests, wrestling contests, tug of war, ball games, and a couple other sports that they're very fond of playing. And why are they playing these sports? They're bringing the communities together like Arawakans often like to do, so that we maintain contact with you, so that there's a constant reassurance that you're out there and you're my friend and our treaty is still going. And most of these ceremonial centers in the Greater Antilles are located near rivers. As I walked this particular court, I could hear the Portuguese river, the Rio Português, running along this side. And it actually has a ramp that goes right down to the river. So the people come by canoe, same thing at Caguana. And they walk up into the ceremonial center and they're welcomed and they have a huge areto or celebration. And so the people come together at these things to cement their bonds, but also for very somber religious ceremonies like the death of a cacique or some kind of strange thing that happened in the sky, and people have come to the shamans of this community to help explain it to them. Right, so these different precincts were probably used for lots of different things, but this long giant court here was probably used for some kind of race, maybe. So I don't think they were all used for the ball game. This would make a good ball game court. This one is curved. A couple others are very small. You can't see any major sporting event happening at them like a ball game. And these belts are stone effigies of the belts that were probably awarded to winners of the ball game, or were worn by elites who attended the ball game, because they are found near these courts at places like Caguana. Sometimes incomplete ones. So that's not only where they were used, but where they were made. We do have a tradition of using entheogens or hallucinogens in both of these periods, the Saladoid to the Taino, but in the Saladoid period and amongst the Hoicoid people as well, it was probably a liquid hallucinogen, like maybe evening primrose, whereas for the Taino, it was a powdered entheogen or hallucinogen called cohoba. The practice of purifying yourself before using the entheogen, however, seems to have been a Taino innovation. And these are emetic wands or vomiting sticks or vomitivos that you put down your throat to make yourself vomit whatever was left in your stomach, so your body would be pure before administering the entheogen. Of course, I'm sure you know that if you drink on an empty stomach or use any kind of medicine, it has a lot more profound an effect on your physiognomy. Many of them are made out of manatee bone. You can see how that is clearly a manatee rib. And I guess the last continuity I will point out is one that's a lot subtler. When I shot this photo under the very controlled lights at the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History, I noticed that the shadow is both bat and owl, because remember, they combine those creatures, a bat hanging upside down or an owl right side up. But I want you to forget the controlled light that I'm showing you here and consider what this shadow would be like in dancing firelight. And the transformation would be a lot more dynamic as bat became owl. There's also some owl imagery carved right on the surface. So let's review the continuities that we found. We've got figure ground reversal and contour rivalry. We've got curvilinear meanders and scrolls, but also rectilinear ones. We've got spirals signaling the passage of time, but perhaps also the drippage of water, hourglass motifs that are in, out symbols, volutes that are bat wings, punctilinear incisions on pottery seems to be a stylistic element going all the way back to the Barancoid. We've got coffee bean eyes, which are also Barancoid, that are kept alive by the Taino. 1,500 years later, we've got the streaming eyes and the gnashed teeth of the shaman as he enters into the vision quest. We've got wrapped figures or swaddled figures for their funerals, wrapped in their hammocks. We've got zoomorphs. The most popular zoomorph of the Saladoid become the official zoomorphs of the Taino: bats, turtles, owls, aquatic birds, frogs. There's also the development of the Frog Labyrinth in the Saladoid that then becomes also a standard symbol for the Taino. We've got trigonal semis, the symbol of the pre-Columbian Caribbean. There's no object like it anywhere else. We've got dujos that start in the Saladoid as benches and become hammocks in the Taino, and we've got plazas that started out in the Saladoid era, but then slowly develop into bigger and more diversified ceremonial centers. And we do have some distinctions as well, obviously, with the geometric versus organic forms. That's definitely a departure. We've got painted versus incised modeled pottery. The early version from the Saladoid is painted, and they basically forget about painting in the Taino. That's a major difference. We've got bates and other ceremonial precincts that are added by the Taino to the ceremonial plazas of the Saladoid. We've got cohoba inhalers that are for a powder versus a liquid in earlier times. We've got cohoba pedestals that are for the preparation of that powder. And we've got vomitivos or emetic wands for the purification of the body before that. And just to end, I'm pointing out that sometimes we've got Saladoid elements in art that's considered Taino, which should probably be carbon dated, because the way they paint this fish in reverse with dropouts is how the Saladoid paint things. It's not how the Taino usually paint things. And the continuities during the conquest, they crossed the conquest, and the Pigarini Museum had this object in its African section for years because the beadwork kind of reminded them of Cameroonian and Nigerian beadwork. And then this face is made out of rhinoceros horn, rather. But then it turns out this is all Taino imagery, as I've been explaining to you, right? The bat wing symbol. And this is definitely a bat face. And the face on the reverse, which is a human face, so it's Janus face, is made out of rhinoceros horn because the Taino workshop survived to trade with the Europeans who sold them European objects like mirrors, but also African materials like rhinoceros horn, right? Mirror from Europe, rhinoceros horn from Africa. Now we've entered into the conquest era where cultures of the world are colliding. But this Taino workshop that made these objects seem to have remained in existence, probably because of some kind of trade deal they had with Spaniards. But we know those things eventually fell apart. Look at this bat face, look at that bat face. Look at the ear spools, look at the ear spools. The wing symbols here become geometric over here. And Deminan Caracaracol is back to show you how to wear one of these belts. The face goes on the back where it watches your back, literally. As you approach a person from behind, he's got this semi protecting him. I don't know if you know, but our common phrase, sepi, which is a kind of charm to get you through a difficult situation, is probably derived from the word semi. And so I end with these images of continued traditions that have not died. We are still here, like the senator said. This is a workshop of Alice Cheveret up in the mountains of Morovis in Puerto Rico. And this is a photo. I can't even take credit for it because my wife might have taken this photo, because we spent the last week of our honeymoon in Dominica during their 100th anniversary of the Kalinago territory. I was very encouraged to see the continued traditions while they're also making more commercial baskets for like Pottery Barn and stuff like that. I was also encouraged to see guys doing the basketry, because when your population is drastically reduced, there's no time to maintain the old gender divisions. Not that they were ever that strict in the first place. Waterproof telescoping basket that I got from Chief Williams, Charles Williams, when we stayed with him and Margaret at their house on the honeymoon. So I show you these images to show you that it's not just that the traditions continue, the traditions are also innovating, but that's a completely other talk. So I'm going to end there, and I'm going to escape from this. Should I stop sharing? Yes. All right. Make sure you're, my hosts, make sure you're unmuted. I'll take any questions. I think I ran way over time, so I apologize for that.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Waldron.
I couldn't stop myself, I'm sorry.
Well, just from the comments, I'm seeing that the participants were riveted. That was a lot of information, enlightenment on, you know, the artifacts and the sculpture.
Thank you.
A lot of which, you know, some of us who would not have known. I am seeing Martin saying excellent presentation. Tesfa said we loved it. It was riveting and fascinating. And MJ is giving you lots of applause.
I see that one.
Yes, you know. This session was very, very enlightening, brought a lot of meaning. You spoke in the beginning of your presentation, you know, you set the tone when you spoke about stolen land and stolen name. And I thought that was, you know, so powerful, because sometimes we don't really appreciate our history and what was stolen from us. Sometimes we are too shy to say something was stolen from us.
Yeah, because you feel people are going to talk bad about you. That
exactly.
Here comes that guy again. Right.
Exactly. And I think the knowledge that you shared, in your presentation showed, you know, the journey of our ancestors through their sculpture, through their art. It tells their story and our history. And I think that is the start to rebuild our past and our history. Because if we do not know it, then we cannot appreciate what we have and how we share it with the future generations, right? And a lot of times we see, you know, some of the art and some of the ceramics and so, and we do not truly understand what is behind that. And that we have to understand that art history is a living, breathing science. It is not, it tells the past, but the past is who we are. Right. So it is alive. It is alive. And in us, it is alive in us. One of the things you would have mentioned about the multiple languages in the Caribbean, a lot of times, you know, we don't know that. We think that, you know, you just have the Kalinago, you have the Taino and so on, but we have multiple indigenous groups in the Caribbean with as much as 12 languages with their own uniqueness about it. And that the Kalinago is not the only Arawakan speakers. That was powerful.
Yeah.
As well. You know, you mentioned that, you know, a lot of pottery are held in museums, and we appreciate museums because they are the gatekeepers, and without them we may not know a lot of things. But it has intellectual history behind it, as you mentioned.
Mm.
There is an intelligence, the people who would have created it. There was intention and there was meaning behind all of it, you know, and for a lot of us, that meaning is what we would have lost, right? And then once we have that meaning now, then we know how we can transfer that information, all of the continuities that you would have identified this afternoon. I mean, it was just amazing as to how many of these you can see throughout time and the link between the various periods in our culture.
And I should really stress that the reason a lot of those continuities exist is because people don't have to have writing to have memory. There's a way that Western historians, they say prehistoric, and they mean before writing. So there was no history before writing. So the fact that you can see the same emblem in Saladoid pottery, and then you see it in Taino pottery and on their furniture, means that somebody is keeping the memory. The memory is long. It's probably recited and maybe even sung, which is how it was done in Africa as well. And so the memory is kept alive in the people, and sometimes it's kept alive in materials that don't exist anymore. They've rotted away. And so they have lots of ways of keeping their memory. They don't need to write. And of course, now everyone on the Kalinago territory writes, right? But they didn't need that to keep their history. So it's not prehistory, it's history.
Mm-hmm. Of course, definitely. And I must say, Dr. Waldron, that you have Grenadian roots.
Blood family, big up.
Yes, for all of the Grenadians on the chat. We have a few questions.
Okay.
Okay, and I'm going to start off with one that was in the chat. Is there a connection between Baracoid and the Obeah? What's it?
Well, I don't even know how to go at that because there's so many. The Baracoid shamans are comparable to the Saladoid shamans, and then their shamanic tradition passes down to the Taino, and the Taino add a lot of things because they're in contact with different people. The Taino are not just straight Saladoid descendants, they're also descended from the archaic people that they came and met already living there. And those traditions have been transferred in the Greater Antilles. They've been transferred to Vodun. And in the Eastern Caribbean, they've been transferred to some of our Neo-African traditions. In fact, my wife and I are writing a book about bush medicine and its Amerindian origins. It's not just a completely transplanted African thing, but they're also, well, here's how we started, my wife and I, with this bit of research. We listened to the Calypso West Indian Weed Woman. And I sang that calypso to my grandmother, and the Grenadian side of the family comes through her, through Charlottesville and Tobago, back to Grenada. And I sang that song to her, man, piabo, woman, piabo, tantan, falbok, and lemongrass, mini root, gully root, granny backbone. And so we looked up the names of the scientific names of all these bushes, and it turns out more than 50% of them are indigenous plants that if you came from Africa, you would have to learn how to use that bush unless you wanted to poison somebody. So you would have learned it from native shamans. And so the African tradition of bush medicine in the Caribbean is actually an Afro-Amerindian tradition with more than 50% native herbs whose use was taught to African people by native people, native Amerindian people. And the African attitude towards these things would not have been like the European attitude where they came to conquer. They would have come to this new land completely lost and confused and they would have first respected the spirits, the semis, the opias of this land, and then introduced their gods to the semis of this land. They would not have try to put their gods on top of the gods that were already here and smash those gods under. So the two religious traditions would have definitely become one. And so that's how you have things like Obia and Vodun and Santeria and Candomblé today. Those all come out of an Afro-Amerindian tradition. That's the best way I could answer that very big question.
Okay, thank you. There's another question. How do you determine the dates of the artifacts?
Well, some of the artifacts are found in context. So the archaeologists, they test the carbon, the charcoal, the pollen that they find around the artifacts, and they note the date and the style. So when people like me come along and we find a bunch of unprovenience objects in the museum, we know that that style is related to some carbon dates that archaeologists have found. So that's how we can more or less know the date, because objects of this style were found with organic materials that could be dated. So even when we don't have a date, we can guess the date based on the fact that objects just like this one were found with materials that could be dated.
Okay, good.
Detective work.
Of course. I know that you would have mentioned during your presentation that the answer to this question is in one of your books that I'm going to ask, but you can just give us the shortened version.
Okay.
Why do you think that the Arawakan potters were female? You mentioned that. Why do you think they were female?
First of all, they're coming from the mainland where the living peoples, their living relatives, Arawakan speakers, sometimes Jé speakers as well, in the Xingu region of the Amazon, all those potters are female. Secondly, we're talking about people who are 5 foot 4 inches tall at the tallest range. And so the women are going to be a little smaller than that. Those hands are perfect for making the kind of fine pottery that we're looking at today. But it's mostly by ethnographic analogy that other Arawakan peoples today in South America, the pottery is a female profession. They don't have very strict gender rules. So if you have a boy who wants to do pottery, they don't completely ban him from doing that. And Amerindian people are famously not homophobic. So there's a category of two-spirit people where if a boy is more like a girl or a girl is more like a boy, the girl can go maybe on hunting expeditions with the men and the boy can make pottery. But mostly it looks like women were making the pottery just based on ethnographic analogy and on the kind of symbolism, the animal symbols that you find on the pottery. There are very few associated with masculinity. The pelican is a good exception, but most of the symbols are associated with femininity, like frogs, turtles. And so you're getting it from female hands, the female mind. Half of my last book was all about pottery because I'm like, okay, you know, all the Taino books are just about sculpture, which is man stuff. I'm going to have a book that's half the art of the males and half the art of the females. So half of my book is ceramics because I maintain that the ceramicists were female for those number of reasons I offer.
Great. This is so interesting. And the last question from the chat, how do we get your book in Grenada?
Oh my gosh. Okay, so get an institution to buy it, because I bargained with my publisher as best I could. And I said, well, people in the Caribbean are not going to be able to afford this reference book because they made my book a reference book. And you know, the reference books in the library, you can't even check them out because they cost so much. So the book is like 125 US. And I read a very nice review of the books the other day, but that was the one complaint that the reviewer had, that the books are prohibitively expensive. So if you can get an institution to buy the book, then everyone can go to the institution and use the book there. They can't stop you from taking cell phone photos from the book. You could change the JPEGs into PDFs. I'm teaching you how to bootleg my book, basically. Because that's the best we can do. They absolutely forbid me from sending the proof out for free. The proof has proof printed all over it, but they forbid the authors from bootlegging it that way. So you're gonna have to bootleg it on your own, study it at an institution, get one of the organizations to save up money and buy it. Because, and in my next book, I switched to UE Press because I hope that UE will be able to offer the research cheaper than the American publisher that put out my first two books.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Waldron, for that information. And let me thank you again for such an excellent, awe-inspiring, enlightening, clarifying presentation this afternoon. I think I speak for all the panelists and the attendees when I said it was time well spent. Thank you very much.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
And at this time, we have a special announcement before we wrap up. A special announcement. And we are pleased to announce the 2023 Indigenous Peoples Heritage Educational Dialogue with John Angus Martin. On the last Sunday of May, it will be moderated by Tesfa Peterson, focusing on John Angus Martin's second edition of the A to Z of Grenada's Heritage, to be released in 2022. This dialogue will address and review Martin's A to Z publication and excerpts of his PhD dissertation with special reference to the Indigenous people's contribution to Grenada's present landscape. We will also continue our outreach to the Kalinago community of Dominica as we build our collaboration, including developing the idea of a teacher-student exchange program and visit. That sounds amazing. The IPHSO will also unveil the L'Amour des Sauterres Leapers Hill citation during the 2023 Educational Dialogue. So this is our special announcement. Look forward to that event. At this time, I am going to invite Lindona to do our closing and vote of thanks. Lindona?
Thank you, Ratisha. Indeed, an informative, thought-provoking session. On behalf of the Indigenous Peoples Heritage Support Organization Preparatory Committee, we wish to extend sincere thanks and appreciation to all who have made this evening's session possible. A special thank you to my co-host Ratisha, who did an amazing job in her contributions this evening. To Ambassador Gill, we are grateful for your continued work and service in promoting awareness of a unique heritage. Thank you, Senator Annette Sanford, for your passion and your encouragement to propel us to remember and give voice to our past so we can build a true sense of who we are as a people. Dr. Waldron, our guest speaker, it was truly an edifying experience delving into this historical journey with you. We are thankful for this experience and we look forward to more interactions with you as we connect with our archaeological footprint. To our guests from across the region, scholars from the region, Europe, and North and South America, members of the IPE, PHSP, and GPAN projects, community members from Sauterres and La Poterie, history students, teachers, all other invited guests, your presence was instrumental in making tonight's discourse a success. We appreciate the time and efforts you graciously extended, and we look forward to your continued support as we engage in matters of culture and history and reviving our heritage. A blessed night, everyone. Take care.